The document that ended 35 years of silence arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1994, carried by a man I had never seen before and would never see again. He knocked once. He placed a manila envelope in my hands without speaking. He left before I could ask his name. I stood in the doorway of my apartment in Novosibirsk for a long time after the sound of his footsteps faded down the stairwell, holding the envelope against my chest, not yet looking at it. I knew from the weight of it what it contained, not specifically, but generally. I had been waiting for something like this for 35 years, in the way that people wait for things they believe will eventually arrive, because the alternative, that the world has simply continued without accounting for what they witnessed, is a form of madness they cannot accept. The envelope contained 14 pages of typed text, 3 hand-annotated maps, a note on plain paper that read, "These were sealed. They should not have been." I sat with the envelope on my kitchen table for 3 days before I opened it fully. I ate. I slept badly. I went outside once to buy bread and stood in the cold for 20 minutes, looking at the street, and then came back in without the bread. On the 3rd evening I made tea, turned on every light in the apartment, and read all 14 pages from beginning to end without stopping. My name is Alexei Grigorievich Petrov. I am 81 years old. I was 26 in November of 1959. Laugh. Newly appointed as a junior geologist on a survey team dispatched by the Soviet Ministry of Geology to assess the mineral potential of a cave system in the western Verkhoyansk range, approximately 340 kilometers northeast of Yakutsk, in what was then the Yakut Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. I had been selected because I had written my graduate thesis on the limestone karst formations of eastern Siberia, and because I spoke a serviceable amount of the Evenki language, which the ministry believed would be useful in dealing with the indigenous communities near the survey site. This proved irrelevant. The Evenki people in the area of the cave would not speak to us at all. I want to be precise about who I was at that time because precision matters when you are describing something that most people will choose to dismiss. I was not an imaginative young man in the literary sense. I had no particular interest in folklore or mystery. I had a strong interest in limestone karst formations, in mineralogy, in the careful documentation of geological phenomena. I kept detailed field notes. I measured things. I wrote numbers in columns and checked my arithmetic twice. I was exactly the kind of person you would want with you in a situation requiring accurate observation and careful recording, and I want the record to reflect that. Because what I observed and recorded in that cave in November of 1959 was not the product of an excitable mind. It was the product of a careful one. There were 6 of us on the team. Dmitry Semyonovich Volkov was our lead geologist, a well-regarded scientist from Moscow with a reputation for efficiency and a disinclination for doubt. Irina Alexandrovna Morozova was our senior mineralogist, approximately 40 years old at the time, precise in a way that made some of the men uncomfortable, and in possession of a kind of professional courage I came to admire very much in the weeks that followed. Gennady Ilyich Rykov was our government liaison. He had been introduced to us at the briefing in Yakutsk simply as a ministry representative, which explained nothing about his presence because the Ministry of Geology did not typically send representatives on routine mineralogical surveys. He carried a separate case of equipment that none of us examined. He filed reports each evening apart from the rest of us. He had very calm eyes. Tikhon and Boris were our field workers, both experienced in remote survey conditions, both economical in speech in the way that men who have spent years doing difficult physical work in isolated places tend to be. I respected them both. I think of them both often. We arrived at the staging area in the 2nd week of November by truck from Yakutsk. The temperature at our arrival was 31 Celsius below zero and dropping. The light lasted perhaps 3 hours a day at that latitude in that season, a pale grey light that came from the south and never properly arrived before it was already leaving. The Verkhoyansk range in winter is one of the most silent places on the surface of this earth. The ridges extend north to south in parallel lines, enormous and old and indifferent, and the snow between them absorbs sound so completely that on calm days the absence of noise becomes a presence of its own, a pressure that sits behind your ears and does not leave. The cave entrance was set into a limestone cliff face approximately 40 meters above the valley floor, accessible by a narrow path that had been cut into the slope at some earlier period, possibly by a survey party in the 1930s, and that was passable but badly iced. The entrance itself was 4 meters wide and 2.5 meters high, a horizontal slash in the grey rock that exhaled cold air in visible plumes. We spent the first 2 days establishing camp on the slope below the entrance, building a windbreak of timber we had carried on the truck, setting up our instruments and our cooking equipment and our sleeping arrangements, and conducting a preliminary examination of the first 200 meters of the main cave passage. I should describe what a limestone cave in the Verkhoyansk region feels like in its early passages, because this description is necessary context for everything that follows. The first 150 meters of the main passage were cold, approximately -12°C, and absolutely dark beyond the reach of our lanterns. The walls were pale grey limestone with occasional calcite formations that caught the light and threw it back in scattered points. The floor was stone and hard-packed sediment. The sounds of the cave in its early section were the sounds any cave produces: the movement of cold air through the passages, a faint crystalline clicking from thermal contraction in the rock, the distant sound of nothing, which in a cave is itself a sound, a particular quality of absence that you learn to read as information about the size and shape of the space around you. We were competent. We moved carefully. We marked our route at regular intervals with red paint on the rock face. We measured and sketched and noted. On the afternoon of the second day, we reached the point where the main passage divided. The left branch was wider and bore marks of earlier human passage, old survey scratches in the rock with iron tools that Volkov dated to the early 19th century or possibly earlier. The right branch was narrower, descended at a steeper angle, and showed no evidence of prior access. Volkov looked at both branches for a long time. Then he pointed right and said we would begin there in the morning. That night, the first night of the survey proper, I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the cave. This was not deliberate. I had always been a light sleeper in the field, sensitive to changes in the ambient sound environment. And in the first nights of a survey, the mind catalogues the acoustic baseline of a new location, the way the eye catalogues a new visual environment. I lay still and listened to the cave breathe. The cave breathed very slowly. The air that moved through the entrance passage and past our windbreak was cold and moved in a rhythm that was not quite the rhythm of wind, slower and more deliberate, as if the cave were drawing breath at an interval measured in minutes rather than seconds. I listened to this for a long time. I thought about limestone karst hydrology. I thought about the survey plan for the morning. Eventually I fell asleep. Nothing woke me that night. But in the morning, over breakfast, Tikhon said he had heard something toward 2 in the morning. He described it in passing, the way you mention weather observations over a meal. He said he had heard, from outside the windbreak, from somewhere above on the cliff face, a sound he would describe as a dry scraping, repeated. He had listened for several minutes, and then it had stopped. He had gone back to sleep. He did not seem disturbed by this. He mentioned it the way a man who has spent a great deal of time in the wilderness mentions unusual sounds, as information, not as alarm. Volkov said it was frost in the rock. Tikhon nodded. Boris said nothing. I noted it in my field book with the time Tikhon had provided, and his description verbatim. The 5th day, the first full day of pushing deeper into the right branch, was when I began to understand that the cave we had entered was not the cave described in the ministry's preliminary survey documentation. I did not say this to anyone. I wrote it in my notebook as a question. Does the system extend further than the ministry's pre-survey indicates? And if so, on what basis was the prior boundary established? The passage descended at a gentle angle for its first 300 meters and then dropped more sharply, and at the point of the drop the air temperature changed in a way I recorded as anomalous. It should have gotten colder as we descended. Instead, it leveled out at approximately -8°C and held there. Volkov noted this and said it might indicate a geothermal influence at depth. Irina said she thought the geological character of the walls had changed at that point too, that the limestone showed a different formation history below the drop than above it, as if the lower cave were older. Not older by geological standards, she said carefully, but older in the sense of having been sealed off from the normal processes of surface influence for a very long time. At the base of the steeper section, the passage opened into the first major chamber of the lower system. It was large enough that our lanterns could not illuminate the far wall from the entrance point, and we had to walk to the center of it before the walls came into view in all directions. The floor of this chamber was flat and smooth. Smoothed by water, which would be the expected cause, but water smoothing leaves a texture, a particular kind of micro-erosion that a trained geologist recognizes immediately. And the texture I found on that floor was different. Irina knelt immediately on entering and ran her palms across the stone and said, without inflection, "This has been walked on. Not by a small number of people on a small number of occasions. This has been walked on by a large number of something over a very long period of time. The stone at the surface has been compressed and polished in a way that takes repeated heavy physical contact to produce." Volkov said she was interpreting a natural surface. Irina said she was not. I did not join this debate. I was looking at the far wall. The ceiling of the chamber rose to a height we later estimated at approximately 18 meters. At the ceiling, visible when I aimed my strongest lantern upward, were formations. Stalactite clusters, calcite drapes, the geological decorations that accumulate in cave systems over tens of thousands of years. Some of these were intact, others had been broken. Not broken in a way consistent with seismic damage or collapse from below, broken from above, from their attachment points at the ceiling, in a way that would require access to the ceiling. Irina saw this too. She said nothing about it for the remainder of that day. That evening in camp, she wrote in her private notebook for almost an hour without stopping, and when I caught her eye over her tea, she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as controlled alarm. That was the first night I had genuine difficulty sleeping. Tikhon heard the sound again that night, or he said he did in the morning, from the cliff face above the cave entrance. He described it differently this time. Not scraping. Movement, he said. Something moving upward on the rock face. He said it slowly, with the careful language of a man being precise about something he knows is unusual. Volkov said a fox or a marten could have been ascending the cliff face, and the cold air was distorting the sound. Tikhon looked at him and said he did not think so. Boris said nothing. Rykov, who had been writing in his notebook across the camp, stopped writing for a moment when Tikhon said this, and then resumed without comment. On the 6th day, I heard the clicking for the first time clearly and close. We were in the main chamber, approximately 40 meters from the far wall, when I heard it. It came from the wall itself, from a horizontal fissure running at approximately 2 meters above the floor across a section of the far face. The sound lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 clicks, evenly spaced, at an interval I later estimated at roughly 1 click per second. Then silence. Then, after a pause of perhaps 8 seconds, a single click, lower in pitch and longer in duration than the preceding 4. I stood still. I noted the time. I noted the location of the sound source, as precisely as I could estimate. I said nothing to the others. Volkov was across the chamber, with Irina discussing the calcite formations. Rykov was near the chamber entrance. Boris was setting down a case of equipment. None of them had their attention directed toward the far wall. I walked to the fissure. It was too narrow for a person to enter, barely wide enough for a hand. I held my lantern near the opening and looked into it. The darkness inside was absolute. The air moving out of it was warmer than the chamber air by a noticeable margin, and it carried a smell I could not immediately identify. Not the mineral smell of the cave. Not the smell of stagnant water or decomposition. Something alive. Not unpleasant, just unmistakably alive. I stepped back from the fissure and stood there for a moment, and then rejoined the others. That evening, I told Volkov I had heard an anomalous sound from the far fissure and asked if we would investigate. He said yes, in the morning. He noted it in his summary log as possible acoustic anomaly from passage behind far wall fissure, source to be investigated. This was the only reference to anything unusual that Volkov included in any of his formal logs. I do not know if this was deliberate, or if he simply had not yet allowed himself to process what was accumulating around us. The 7th day, Boris found the footprint. We were working in the connecting passage beyond the main chamber, at the base of a slight slope where fine, pale silt had accumulated in the depression. The footprint was clear and sharp-edged. indicating the silt had not moved since the print was made. It was 28 centimeters in length. It had 4 toes, widely spaced, with the inner toe much shorter than the outer 3. The impression showed no heel. Whatever weight had made this print had landed on the ball of the foot and the toes, and the distribution of pressure across the toe marks suggested a gait that placed primary weight on the outer foot, not the inner, the reverse of a human walking gait. The depth of the impression relative to the density of the silt suggested a creature of considerable weight. Boris crouched beside it for a long time without speaking. Rykov photographed it from 4 angles, working methodically and without being asked, the camera shutter very loud in the silence of the passage. Volkov looked at it for several seconds and said the silt compression might have distorted a bear track. Irina knelt and measured it with her calipers and said the proportions were not consistent with any bear species found in this region. She said she would need to refer to a zoological reference to be certain, but that in her opinion this print had not been made by any animal she could name. Nobody responded to this directly. We resumed working. The footprint was not mentioned again for the remainder of that day. I lay awake a long time that 7th night, listening. The cave sounds had not changed in any way I could specifically identify, but my sensitivity to them had changed. I was listening now in the way that you listen when you know that what you are listening for exists, rather than in the way you listen to determine whether something exists. This is a different kind of listening. It is more tiring. Every sound the cave made resolved itself first into possible significance and then into its geological explanation, and this process repeated on a loop that prevented real rest. What I heard, at approximately 1 in the morning by my watch, was the low, resonant vibration, not a sound exactly. I felt it before I heard it, as a faint pressure against the floor through my sleeping bag, and then as a sensation in my chest at a frequency too low to process as clear sound. It lasted for perhaps 40 minutes. It came from deep in the cave, from a direction I could not fix with certainty, but that I associated with the lower passages beyond the main chamber. It rose and fell in intensity without a regular pattern. It felt enormous. In the morning, I asked Tikhon quietly if he had felt anything during the night. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Yes." He did not say anything else, and I did not ask. The 8th day was the last day on which the survey felt like a normal survey. We pushed to a depth I estimated at approximately 900 meters below the cave entrance, following the connecting passage beyond the main chamber for several hundred meters until it descended sharply and opened into the long chamber, which was what I called it in my field notes because I could not find a more accurate word for it. This chamber was different in character from everything above it. Where the main chamber had been roughly circular, this chamber was oriented on a roughly east-west axis, narrow relative to its length, perhaps 8 meters wide and at least 60 meters long with no visible end at our lantern range. The ceiling was low, approximately 4 meters at its highest point, and the walls, both walls, for the entire visible length of the chamber, were covered in markings. I want to be precise about these markings because I have spent 60 years thinking about them, and have arrived at a description I believe is as accurate as language allows. They were not pictographs in the sense that anthropological literature uses that term. They did not depict animals, hunting scenes, human figures, celestial objects, or any of the other subjects that characterize known prehistoric cave art. They were patterns of repeated shapes, scored into the limestone with something harder than the stone, arranged in horizontal rows. The shapes were consistent across the entire visible surface of both walls. They recurred in arrangements that followed systematic rules I could not decode, but that were recognizably rules. Some arrangements repeated in regular intervals along the wall. Others appeared once. The scoring was deep and clean. Irina ran her finger along one of the marks and said the tool that made it had a hardness she could not estimate without laboratory analysis, but that it had clearly been very hard. She said the marks were old. She could not say how old without analysis, but she said they did not feel recent, and she was not using feel in any subjective sense. She was using it in the precise geological sense of surface weathering and mineral infill. Volkov stood in the middle of the long chamber and turned slowly, looking at the walls, for perhaps 2 full minutes. Then he said, "Document everything." He said this quietly. He was still looking at the walls when he said it. We photographed for 2 hours. Rykov used the camera for most of this period. He photographed systematically, one section at a time, overlapping the frames to create a continuous record. He worked without speaking. At some point during the second hour of photography, he stopped and looked at a particular section of the marking patterns for an extended period without photographing it, and then photographed it very carefully from multiple distances. I watched him do this. His expression did not change, but his movements slowed, and I had the impression that he was looking at something he recognized. I did not approach him about this. On the return from the long chamber on the 8th day, I heard the sounds clearly for the first time during the hours of activity, rather than at night. I was at the rear of the line in the connecting passage, approximately 20 meters behind Volkov at the front, when I first heard it above me. A sound like adhesion and release against stone, the sound of pressure applied to a surface and then removed, repeated, moving. It came from the ceiling of the passage, which was approximately 3 meters above the floor. I raised my lantern. I could not see the source. The ceiling in that section of the passage was irregular, showing many small projections and depressions, and the lantern light created heavy shadows between the projections. The sound moved ahead of me along the passage, at a pace approximately matching our walking speed, and then stopped. I said nothing to the others. I walked faster to close the gap between myself and Boris, who was walking in front of me. I did not tell him what I had heard. I did not want to say it out loud in the passage. When we reached the main chamber, the sound stopped entirely. The main chamber felt different on this return crossing than it had in the morning. The feeling was not visual and not auditory. It was the feeling that a space produces when something in it has changed, the same feeling that a room produces when someone has been inside it while you were absent. Not a paranormal sensation, a practical one. Something about the distribution of air, or the quality of the silence, or some other physical attribute that perception registers before the conscious mind provides an explanation. I crossed the main chamber quickly and did not look toward the fissure in the far wall. On the 9th day, Tikhon was ill. His fever had started in the night. By morning it was high enough to make him confused. He could stand but could not walk steadily, and his eyes were not focusing properly. We had a medical kit that contained what was adequate for minor injuries and common field ailments, but not for a fever of this severity this far from any medical facility. Boris said he would stay in camp with Tikhon. He said this before Volkov could make the assignment, and in a tone that indicated he had already decided and was informing rather than requesting. Volkov agreed. Boris sat beside Tikhon's sleeping bag and did not look at the cave entrance, and I noticed this, the deliberateness of not looking at the cave entrance, the controlled direction of attention away from a specific location. The remaining 4 of us descended to the long chamber without Boris and Tikhon. The day passed in continued documentation and in a second examination of the lower passage beyond the long chamber, which descended still further and which we did not have time to explore fully. Volkov was noting possible mineral indicators in the rock at the base of the lower passage when Irina came to stand beside me near the long chamber entrance and said, very quietly, that she had been thinking about the scoring marks on the walls. She said she believed the marks were a maintenance record. She did not know what was being maintained or measured or communicated, but the pattern of repetition and variation was consistent with something being recorded over time by multiple individuals working to a shared system. The marks at the eastern end of the chamber were more recent than those at the western end, in a relative sense, more deeply scored and less weathered, which suggested the records had progressed from west to east over time. She said over time in a voice that placed weight on the words carefully and did not expand on what she meant by it. I asked her what she thought the marks represented. She said she did not know. She said she thought the entities that made them had been using this chamber for a very long time, and that their record-keeping had a character more similar to an institutional archive than to any form of human art or ritual. New. I asked her how she had arrived at the word institutional. She said, because of the regularity, because of the absence of individual variation. Because whatever is being recorded here is not one being's experience. It is a collective record maintained by many individuals over time. That is what institutional means. Rykov was listening. He had his back to us and was photographing a section of the wall, but the passage was small and he could not have failed to hear this exchange. He did not turn around. He continued photographing. He did not include Irina's analysis in his report to Volkov that evening. I know this because I was nearby when Volkov asked him for the day's summary, and the long chamber marks were not mentioned. The 9th night was the worst night before the 12th. The resonant vibration returned at approximately 10 in the evening and lasted until sometime after 2 in the morning, by which point I had stopped checking my watch. It was louder than it had been, or my sensitivity to it had increased, and it was accompanied this time by the clicking, which I could hear as distinct sound superimposed on the vibration, coming from different locations at different times, sometimes from inside the cave at depth, sometimes from the cliff face above the entrance, sometimes from a direction I could not fix at all. The intervals were always the same: 4 clicks, pause, 1 low click. This sequence repeated at varying intervals, sometimes 2 minutes apart, sometimes 10, without any pattern I could identify. I lay on my back and listened to it, and tried to think about it the way I had been trained to think about geological data, without anticipation or narrative, just observation. The observation was, this is a communication. Something is communicating across this space and across the rock above it, and whatever is communicating is doing it in a language that has consistent grammar and that I cannot interpret. I said nothing in the morning. Boris had dark marks under his eyes. Tikhon was better, his fever lower, and he ate a small breakfast sitting up, but he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual economy of speech, a quietness that had a specific texture to it, the texture of someone who has been awake and thinking for many hours and arrived somewhere they did not intend to go. The 10th and 11th days were a drawn descent toward the 12th night. Each day we went below and documented and measured and spoke to each other in the technical language of our professions, and each evening we returned to the surface and ate and tried to sleep. And each night the sounds were present. What changed over those 2 days was the quality of the sounds. The clicking became more frequent. The resonant vibration extended its hours. And a new element appeared on the 10th night, a sound from inside the cave, from somewhere in the upper passages between the main chamber and the cave entrance, that I can describe only as the sound of something moving along walls in a pattern that did not correspond to the pattern of a cave floor, not footsteps, not the scraping of something being dragged. The sound of adhesion and release, of something pressing against a vertical surface and moving across it, repeated at intervals that suggested deliberate and controlled movement. We all heard it. We did not discuss it. The silence around the camp that night, the silence of 6 people choosing not to speak about what they were hearing, had a quality I have never forgotten. On the morning of the 11th day, Boris said to me, "Do you ever feel like we were allowed to come this far?" I asked him what he meant. He said he meant that he had been thinking about the footprint in the silt. He said that the silt in that section of the passage was undisturbed everywhere except where the single print appeared, and that in his experience of fieldwork in remote areas, creatures that inhabit a space leave many signs, many prints, many traces. A single clear print in otherwise undisturbed silt, he said, did not feel like an accident. It felt like something that was placed there to be found. I asked him why something would place a footprint to be found. He said he did not know, but that he had been a field worker for 20 years, and he knew the difference between a space where animals lived in the way that animals live in spaces, and a space where something was managing its own visibility. I thought about this for the rest of that day. Volkov announced on the morning of the 12th day that the survey was substantially complete and that we would spend the final 2 days confirming measurements and begin packing for departure. There was a quality to the camp that morning, a careful, controlled relief that no one expressed and that everyone felt. Irina spent the 12th day compiling her notes without going below. Rykov packed his separate case and sealed it and placed it with his personal equipment. Boris and Tikhon moved equipment to the staging point below the cliff face. Volkov and I made one final descent to confirm our depth measurements in the lower passage, and on the return crossing of the main chamber, I stopped and turned and raised my lantern toward the fissure in the far wall. There was nothing visible. The fissure was dark, and the cave was silent. I stood there for 30 seconds. Then, at the very edge of my lantern's reach, in the shadow beside the fissure, I saw the 2 points of luminescence. They were spaced approximately 30 centimeters apart. They were at a height of roughly 2 meters. They were not moving. They were looking at me with a steadiness that made the word looking feel inadequate, and yet remain the only word available. I lowered the lantern and turned and walked to the passage and continued upward without hurrying, because hurrying felt like the wrong thing to do, like a concession I did not want to make. I told no one. That evening felt like a held breath. We ate, Rykov wrote. Volkov read his field notes. Irina drank her tea standing up and looked at nothing in particular. Tikhon and Boris sat together close to the windbreak and talked quietly about something that was not the cave. I sat with my field book open and wrote the day's observations in careful columns. Boris established a watch rotation that night. It was informal, never discussed as a formal decision, just Boris saying he would take the first watch and naming hours for the rest of us, and everyone agreeing without discussion, which is the way that people agree to things when they already know why the thing is necessary and do not want to say it. At approximately 11 o'clock, while I was lying in my sleeping bag during Rykov's watch and not sleeping, I heard Boris say our names in a low voice, not a shout, not urgent, just our names, one after another, spoken in the kind of voice you use to wake someone without startling them. I sat up. The others were already sitting up. Boris was at the edge of the windbreak, facing uphill, facing the cave entrance. The cave entrance was lit from within. I have spent 60 years trying to find accurate language for what I saw in that entrance and have never fully succeeded. The light was pale. It had a greenish quality. Not the green of something chemical, not bioluminescence as I have seen it described in photographs of ocean organisms, not the green of a lantern with colored glass. Something between those things. A pale, cold luminescence that moved within the cave entrance but did not flicker, that brightened and dimmed in a rhythm that was not the rhythm of any combustion process. It illuminated the interior of the entrance passage to a depth of perhaps 5 meters, and in that illuminated space, standing without movement, was a shape. I will describe what I saw as accurately as I am able. The shape was upright. It stood on 2 limbs. The lower limbs bent at the knee, in a posture that placed the body's center of gravity lower than a human standing posture. A slight crouch that was not threatening, but was simply different. The way an animal sits in a different geometry from a human sitting. The upper limbs were long. I estimated the full height of the figure at approximately 2.5 meters, though the posture made a precise estimate difficult. The head was held level, and the face, if it was a face, was oriented toward us, toward the camp below the cliff face, with a stillness that was not the stillness of a creature that does not know it is being observed. It was the stillness of something that is observing. We watched each other, if that is the right way to describe it, for a period I estimated at 40 seconds. My watch was in my sleeping bag. My mind was very clear. I was aware of the temperature, which was -34 Celsius. I was aware of the complete silence of the cliff face. I was aware of the breathing of the 5 people around me, which was slow and controlled, the breathing of people who have decided to be very still. The shape in the cave entrance did not move throughout this period. Then it stepped backward into the cave. The light diminished over approximately 10 seconds. The entrance was dark. Rykov stood up before any of the rest of us. He went to his sealed case, opened it, removed a document I had not seen before, and sat down under his lantern and read it. He read for approximately 15 minutes. He did not share what the document said. When he was done, he folded it and replaced it in the case and said that in the morning we would begin packing for departure. Volkov asked if this was a recommendation. Rykov said it was an instruction. We did not sleep. We sat in the windbreak until first light and listened to the clicking from the cliff face above, which continued without interruption until the sky began to gray in the south. In the morning, we packed with the focused efficiency of people who have a single goal. I made 3 trips to the cave to retrieve equipment from the upper passage observation station. On my 3rd trip, approximately 50 meters inside the cave, I stopped and listened to the cave for the last time. The cave was completely silent. Not the baseline silence of a geological system in operation, not the sum of all the small sounds of air and water and thermal adjustment that a cave normally produces. A different silence. The absence of all of those things simultaneously. I have been in silent places in 60 years of fieldwork, in deserts and tundra and deep forest, and I know what natural silence sounds like. This was not natural silence. This was the silence of a space that has stopped doing what it was doing, Not because the processes have ended, but because a decision has been made. Something in that cave had decided to stop, and in that moment of perfect stillness, standing alone 50 meters inside a Siberian limestone system in the winter of 1959, I understood with complete certainty that the silence was a message and that the message was, "You may go." We left the cave on the 12th day at 3 in the afternoon. The truck reached Yakutsk at approximately 10 in the evening. Nobody spoke for the entire journey. Rykov sat in the front. The rest of us were in the back with the equipment, and the truck engine was very loud, and the darkness outside the rear flap was the darkness of the Verkhoyansk winter, absolute and cold. I filed my section of the survey report in January of 1960. I described a limestone cave system of moderate geological interest and documented the karst formations in the standard format. I described the 3 chambers. I noted the calcite deposits and the thermal anomaly at depth. I did not mention the scored walls in the long chamber. I did not mention the footprint. I did not mention the sounds, the luminescent figure, the silence on the morning of departure. I wrote these things in my private field notes, which I have kept in a locked drawer for 66 years and which I have never shown to anyone. Irina Alexandrovna Morozova submitted a separate addendum to the Geological Commission in January of 1960, requesting a follow-up survey with paleographic expertise and a larger team. She described the marked chamber in precise terms and presented her analysis of the patterns as evidence of systematic record-keeping by an unknown agency. The Commission's archive contains no record of this addendum. I looked in 1991, in 1993, and again in 1994, after the envelope arrived. The addendum is gone. Rykov was transferred to the Magadan region in February of 1960. He does not appear in any ministry employment record after that date. I have not been able to determine what happened to him. Irina died in 1991. I was not informed of this at the time and learned it second-hand from a colleague at a symposium in 1997. Tikhon submitted a medical leave request immediately on our return and was granted 6 months. I saw him once after that, in 1963, and we spoke about the survey for 45 seconds in a corridor before someone we knew passed us, and we changed the subject. He died in 1979. I sent flowers without a note. The cave system was omitted from the 1962 geological survey map of the Verkhoyansk range. In its place, there is a reference number that does not correspond to any entry in the survey index. The 14 pages in Rykov's report described everything. Not everything that we had seen, which I do not believe any of us described fully, even to ourselves, but everything that the Soviet internal security apparatus knew about the cave system and had known for some time prior to our survey. Rykov had not been sent with us to observe us. He had been sent to manage information. He had known roughly what we would find. He had files on prior incidents in other cave systems in 3 other locations in the USSR, in which comparable encounters had been documented and sealed. His report was careful and flat and without editorial language. It recommended permanent restriction of access to the cave system. It recommended that our reports be sanitized. It concluded with a single sentence that I have read many times in 30 years. These are not new inhabitants of this territory, and the territory belongs to them. I am 81 years old. I live alone in Novosibirsk. On most nights I sleep adequately. On some nights, a number that has not diminished in 30 years, I lie in the dark before sleep and hear the clicking. 4 clicks, even intervals, then a pause, then one low click of a different pitch and longer duration. Always exactly the same intervals as I measured in my notebook in November of 1959. Always exactly the same final click, low and deliberate, that feels less like a sound and more like punctuation. It is not a distressing sound. It has never felt threatening. I do not know what it means. I have spent 60 years not knowing what it means and have arrived at the conclusion that not knowing is the right state to occupy. Some things were not made to be known by us. Some systems of meaning were built long before we had the apparatus to decode them, and will continue long after we have stopped trying. The cave is still there. The long chamber and its walls are still there. Whatever filled the darkness in that entrance on the 12th night is still there. I am certain of this. I am also certain in a way I cannot prove and do not try to prove, that the 14 pages were sent to me because something wanted someone who had been inside that cave to know, in the time remaining to them, that what they had seen had been known and recorded and protected by people who understood, however imperfectly, what lived beneath the Verkhoyansk range. I keep the pages in a locked drawer. I do not take them out often. I do not need to.